What if a short, foreign-born outsider with a thick accent, no family connections, and no inherited wealth rose from absolute obscurity to become the most powerful man on earth, commanding the largest empire since ancient Rome before the age of 35? What if that same man, at the absolute peak of his power, controlling nearly 70 million people across a continent, made one catastrophic decision that unraveled everything he had spent his entire life building? And what if his final years were spent alone on a windswept island in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, slowly dying, while the world he had conquered moved on without him? This is not fiction. This is Napoleon Bonaparte, military genius, legal reformer, Emperor of France, and the most dramatic rise and fall in the entire history of human power. Buckle up, because this story will leave you breathless. For more incredible, eye-opening videos like this, subscribe to Global Legends Studio right now and hit that bell icon so you never miss a single upload. The Outsider from Corsica. The story of Napoleon Bonaparte begins not in France, but on a small Mediterranean island called Corsica. Born on August 15, 1769, just 1 year after France acquired Corsica from Genoa, Napoleon was technically French by nationality, but culturally, linguistically, and emotionally, he was Corsica. His family, the Bonapartes, were minor local nobility, not rich, not powerful, not connected, just respectable enough to qualify for a French military scholarship. At age 9, young Napoleon was sent to mainland France to attend military school. He arrived speaking broken French with a thick Corsican accent. His classmates mocked him mercilessly for his accent, his poverty, his small stature, his foreign origins. Napoleon responded the only way he knew how. He buried himself in books, mathematics, history, military strategy, geography. He read voraciously, obsessively, consuming the lives of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Hannibal like other boys consumed fairy tales. While his wealthy classmates socialized and played, Napoleon was alone in the library, building an empire inside his mind. His school reports described him as solitary, intense, and fiercely ambitious. "This boy will go far," one instructor wrote, "if circumstances allow." Circumstances were about to allow, beyond anything anyone could have imagined.
Napoleon graduated from the École Militaire in Paris in 1785, finishing a 2-year course in just 1 year, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery at age 16. For several years, he languished in provincial obscurity, a junior officer in a peacetime army with limited prospects. Then, everything changed. In 1789, the French Revolution exploded across France like a volcanic eruption, sweeping away the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the entire social order that had governed Europe for centuries. For most people, the revolution brought chaos, terror, and uncertainty. For Napoleon Bonaparte, it was the greatest opportunity in history. The revolution had decapitated the French officer corps. Aristocratic generals fled or were guillotined. The army desperately needed talented, meritocratic leaders who owed their position to ability, not birth. Napoleon was precisely that man. His moment came in 1793 at the Siege of Toulon, where royalist rebels and British forces had seized France's most important Mediterranean port. The French siege was failing. Napoleon, just 24 years old, took command of the artillery, repositioned the cannons with brilliant tactical insight, and within weeks had forced the British fleet to withdraw and the city to surrender. Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general overnight. He was 24 years old, and he was just getting started. The Italian campaign, A Star is Born. In 1796, the Directory, France's ruling government, gave the young General Bonaparte command of the Army of Italy. It was considered something of a punishment posting. The Army of Italy was underfed, undersupplied, demoralized, and outnumbered by Austrian and Piedmontese forces. Napoleon transformed it in weeks. Through the sheer force of his personality, his presence on the battlefield, his ability to inspire men with words and lead them by example, he turned a rabble into a fighting force of extraordinary effectiveness. What followed was one of the most brilliant military campaigns in history. In just 12 months, Napoleon fought and won 14 major battles against numerically superior forces, crossing the Alps, sweeping through northern Italy, smashing Austrian army after Austrian army, and forcing Austria, one of Europe's greatest powers, to sue for peace. He negotiated the peace terms himself without authorization from Paris. He wrote proclamations to his troops that read like poetry. He sent home wagon loads of Italian art treasures to Paris. He governed conquered territories with surprising administrative skill. France was electrified. Here was a general unlike any other, young, brilliant, victorious, and utterly magnetic. Napoleon returned to Paris as a national hero. The newspapers called him the new Alexander. The people called him the savior of France. He was 28 years old, and France was his for the taking. By 1799, France was exhausted. 10 years of revolution, terror, and war had left the country politically unstable, economically broken, and militarily overstretched. The Directory government was corrupt, incompetent, and deeply unpopular. On November 9, 1799, a date the French calendar recorded as 18 Brumaire, Napoleon Bonaparte launched a carefully planned coup d'état. With the support of key political allies, including the legendary diplomat Talleyrand and his own brother Lucien, Napoleon dissolved the Directory and established a new government called the Consulate. Napoleon became first consul, in theory one of 3 equal rulers. In practice, he was everything. He moved with extraordinary speed to consolidate power. He rewrote the French Constitution, giving himself near absolute authority. He negotiated an end to the wars that had bankrupted France. He signed a concordat with the Pope, re-establishing Catholicism in France and winning the support of the Church. He reformed the legal system, creating the Napoleonic Code, a rational, comprehensive legal framework that still forms the basis of law in France, Belgium, Quebec, Louisiana, and dozens of other jurisdictions worldwide. He reformed education, built roads, reorganized the French banking system, and established the Legion of Honor, France's highest distinction for merit. In 5 years as first consul, Napoleon accomplished more genuine reform than the Revolution had managed in a decade. And in 1804, before the altar of Notre Dame Cathedral, with the Pope watching, Napoleon took the imperial crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. He was now Emperor Napoleon I of France. The military genius, battles that rewrote history. As emperor, Napoleon's military campaigns reached a level of brilliance that military academies still study and marvel at 2 centuries later. His strategic genius rested on several revolutionary principles. Speed. Napoleon's armies moved faster than any in Europe, living off the land rather than slow supply wagons, appearing where enemies least expected them. Concentration of force. Napoleon specialized in dividing enemy armies and then overwhelming each section with superior local numbers before they could reunite. The psychological dimension. Napoleon understood that war was as much about breaking an enemy's will as destroying their forces. He targeted enemy headquarters, communication lines, and morale with surgical precision. The Battle of Austerlitz in December 1805 stands as his undisputed masterpiece. Facing a combined Austrian and Russian army that outnumbered his forces, Napoleon deliberately appeared weak on his right flank, luring the enemy to attack there. Then, when their center had been stripped of troops, he launched a devastating assault that split the Allied army in 2. In less than 9 hours, the combined might of Austria and Russia was shattered. 36,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Napoleon lost fewer than 9,000. It was perhaps the most perfectly executed battle in military history. By 1807, Napoleon controlled or influenced virtually all of continental Europe, from Spain to the borders of Russia, from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The son of a minor Corsican noble had become the master of a continent. But greatness carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. Napoleon's fatal flaw was the same quality that had made him great, his absolute, unshakable belief in his own judgment. In 1808, Napoleon made his first catastrophic error of hubris. He invaded Spain, deposing the Spanish king and placing his own brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. Spain erupted in furious national resistance. The Spanish people, fighting not as a conventional army, but as guerrilla fighters, ambushed French columns, assassinated officers, and made every road and village in Spain a potential death trap. Napoleon's forces, designed for swift, decisive conventional warfare, had no answer for an enemy that simply refused to be defeated. The Peninsular War dragged on for 6 grinding years, draining France of men, money, and morale in an endless, unwinnable conflict. Napoleon himself called it the Spanish ulcer, an infection that slowly poisoned the entire French Empire. He had made the same mistake that powerful men have made throughout history. He confused the ability to conquer a people with the ability to govern them. The Russian catastrophe, 1812. And then Napoleon made the greatest military blunder in history. He invaded Russia. In June 1812, Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, 680,000 soldiers from across his empire. French, German, Polish, Italian, Dutch, and more marched east into the vastness of Russia. The Russian strategy was devastatingly simple. Retreat. Burn everything. Refuse to fight. As Napoleon's army advanced, the Russians destroyed crops, burned villages, and poisoned wells, leaving nothing for the invaders to eat or use. Napoleon reached Moscow in September 1812, only to find the city largely abandoned and then deliberately set on fire by the Russians themselves. He waited in the burned ruins for 5 weeks, expecting the Tsar to negotiate. The Tsar never came. With winter approaching and no supply lines, no shelter, and no enemy to defeat, Napoleon ordered the retreat. What followed was a human catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. The Russian winter, temperatures dropping to -37 degrees Celsius, destroyed what the battles had not. Men froze to death in their thousands. Horses collapsed and were immediately eaten by starving soldiers. Frostbitten men shot themselves rather than continue marching. Of the 680,000 who had marched into Russia with such imperial confidence, fewer than 100,000 returned. The Grande Armée, the finest military force the world had ever seen, had been annihilated not by an enemy general, but by geography, weather, and one man's pride.
The Russian disaster shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility. One by one, the nations he had defeated and humiliated sensed their opportunity and rose against him. Prussia, Austria, Sweden, Russia, Britain, all united in the Sixth Coalition, the largest alliance Europe had ever assembled, with one single purpose: bring Napoleon down. The decisive blow came at the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, known as the Battle of Nations, the largest battle in Europe in history before World War I. Over 500,000 soldiers fought across 3 days of ferocious combat. Napoleon's army, exhausted, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition, was crushed. He retreated back into France. The Allies invaded. Paris fell in March 1814. Napoleon's own marshals, the men he had elevated from obscurity to the highest ranks of European nobility, confronted him in his palace and told him bluntly, "Sire, it is over. We will not fight anymore." Napoleon, the man who had never accepted defeat in his life, had no choice. He abdicated. He was exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba. The Emperor of Europe was now the governor of a tiny island 12 miles wide. The 100 Days, one last gamble. But Napoleon was not finished. In February 1815, astonishingly, Napoleon escaped from Elba with just 700 soldiers and landed on the southern coast of France. The King of France sent an army to arrest him. As that army approached, Napoleon walked forward alone, opened his coat, and called out, "Soldiers, if any of you wishes to shoot your emperor, here I am." There was a long silence. Then, one by one, the soldiers lowered their muskets, broke ranks, and joined him. Napoleon marched to Paris without firing a single shot. The king fled. France erupted in celebration. In what history calls the 100 Days, Napoleon retook power and assembled a new army for one final, desperate campaign.
The decisive moment came at Waterloo in modern Belgium on June 18, 1815. Napoleon faced the British army under Duke of Wellington and waited too long to attack, giving the Prussian army time to arrive and strike his flank. The battle turned, the French broke. Napoleon's last army was destroyed. This time, there would be no return.
After Waterloo, the Allies took no chances. Napoleon was exiled not to a comfortable Mediterranean island, but to St. Helena, a tiny, remote, wind-battered volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, 1,200 miles from the nearest coastline. Escape was impossible. The British stationed 3,000 soldiers and a naval squadron around the island to make certain of it. Napoleon spent his final 6 years on St. Helena in a damp, poorly maintained house called Longwood, plagued by poor health, boredom, and the suffocating surveillance of his British jailers. He dictated his memoirs, carefully crafting the legend he wanted history to remember. He reinvented himself as a champion of liberty, nationalism, and the rights of ordinary people against the old aristocratic order. It was brilliant political theater, performed for an audience of posterity. His health declined steadily. Stomach pains worsened. He lost weight dramatically. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died on St. Helena. He was 51 years old. The official cause was stomach cancer, but many historians now believe he may have been slowly poisoned by arsenic, traces of which have been found in preserved samples of his hair, possibly from the arsenic-laced green wallpaper dye in his damp bedroom, or possibly from deliberate poisoning by enemies who feared even his imprisoned influence. Even in death, the mystery around Napoleon refused to be simple. The legacy that never died. Napoleon Bonaparte rose from a mocked, foreign-born outsider to master of the known world, and fell from that height to a prisoner on a rock in the middle of an ocean. His is the most dramatic arc in the history of human ambition. But here's what makes Napoleon truly immortal. His legal reforms, the Napoleonic Code, govern the lives of hundreds of millions of people today across 5 continents. His administrative reforms, prefectures, the baccalaureate, the Bank of France, the reorganization of education, still shape French society 2 centuries later. His military innovations, corps organization, artillery tactics, psychological warfare, are still studied and applied in military academies from West Point to Sandhurst. The concept of national self-determination, the idea that peoples of common culture and language have the right to govern themselves, was seeded across Europe by Napoleon's campaigns and sparked the nationalist movements that would reshape the entire 19th century. Napoleon himself said it best from his exile on St. Helena. "My true glory is not to have won 40 battles. Waterloo will erase the memory of so many victories. But what nothing will erase, what will live forever, is my civil code." He was right, and he was wrong, because everything about Napoleon Bonaparte lives forever. The victories and the defeats, the genius and the hubris, the reformer and the tyrant, the liberator and the conqueror. He was the greatest proof in history that one human being, armed with nothing but intellect, will, and obsessive ambition, can shake the entire world to its foundations. The question he leaves echoing across the centuries is not whether his life was glorious or tragic. It was both. Completely, magnificently, heartbreakingly both. If you gained any knowledge or inspiration from today's video, please give it a like, drop a comment below with your thoughts, and share it with your friends and family who love history. For more powerful, mind-blowing videos about the legends, conquerors, and visionaries who shaped our world, make sure you subscribe to Global Legends Studio right now. Hit that bell icon and never miss a single video. See you next time. Stay curious, stay inspired.